Beneath the endless sands of Egypt, where the wind hums ancient songs and the Nile glows beneath the first light of dawn, a story sleeps. One older than memory, more fragile than time itself. Every grain of dust carries a whisper from forgotten kings. Every stone remembers the warmth of sacred hands. Yet among all who once wore the crown of gold, one figure burns brighter and stranger than the rest. A ruler who dared to defy eternity, who turned his gaze from the gods of his ancestors and listened to the voice of the sun itself. His name was Akhenaten, and his vision would change the world forever. Before his reign, Egypt was a symphony of devotion, its heart beating in rhythm with the prayers of 1,000 gods. Amun, Osiris, Ra, and countless others governed every breath of life, their temples towering, their priests powerful, their rituals unending. The air itself seemed thick with incense and faith. Yet hidden within that order, something began to stir. A restlessness, a yearning for truth beyond the walls of the sanctuaries. Into this world of divine certainty, Akhenaten was born, a dreamer destined to challenge the heavens. From the moment his eyes first met the horizon, he felt drawn not to idols carved from stone, but to the light that needed no temple, no offering. As he grew, so too did his fascination with the blazing disk of the sun. He saw in it not a god among many, but the heartbeat of existence, pure, silent, eternal. Where others saw a star, he saw divinity itself. That belief would drive him to renounce the faith of millennia, to silence the priests of Amun, and to build a city from which only the sun would rule. But this is not a tale of power alone. It is a story of revelation and ruin, of beauty born from heresy and faith turned to fire. Akhenaten's journey would lift Egypt to heights of spiritual wonder and plunge it into the depths of chaos. He would be called visionary, madman, prophet, and traitor. Yet beyond every judgment, his voice endures, carried by the same light that once touched his face at dawn. His life remains a question burning through time. What happens when a man reaches for the divine without fear? Tonight, as the desert sleeps beneath the same stars that watched him rise, we walk once more through the golden dust of his kingdom. We listen to the silence that followed his name, and to the whisper of sunlight that still lingers over the ruins of his dream. This is the story of the Pharaoh who defied the gods and sought the source of creation itself. A tale of devotion, defiance, and the eternal search for truth hidden behind the sun. If you enjoy stories that breathe life into forgotten worlds, uncover lost empires, and explore the mysteries of human faith and power, subscribe to the channel, like this video, to support future tales, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Your voice helps keep the past alive. Long before Akhenaten's sunlit vision reshaped Egypt, the land thrived beneath the gaze of countless gods. Across the valley of the Nile, temples towered like fortresses of faith, each devoted to a divine power that governed a piece of existence. Amun, concealed and omnipotent, reigned as king among the gods, his presence filling the air of Thebes like invisible fire. Osiris ruled over death and rebirth, while Ra, the ancient sun, sailed across the sky each day in his celestial bark. Every breath of wind, every grain of soil, every movement of the river carried a divine signature. The people lived by ritual and rhythm, their lives tethered to sacred cycles that promised order amid chaos. Processions of priests moved through colossal temple gates with precision and grandeur. Draped in linen adorned with gold, they offered incense, chants, and sacrifice to sustain the balance of Ma'at, the eternal harmony of truth and order. Citizens brought gifts of grain and wine, hoping to secure favor in this intricate web of divinity. Statues of the gods stood cloaked in darkness within holy chambers, hidden from unworthy eyes, their faces gilded with gold leaf that glimmered in torchlight. The air inside these sanctuaries was thick with heat and smoke, the scent of myrrh blending with human breath and fear. Faith was everywhere, but it had become heavy, weighed down by the hands of men who profited from mystery. In the sprawling city of Thebes, the temple of Amun rose like a mountain of stone, dominating the horizon. Behind its walls, priests wielded influence greater than kings. They commanded wealth, armies of servants, and caravans that stretched across the desert, trading incense for power. Their words could crown or condemn a ruler, for they alone interpreted the will of the hidden god. Even pharaohs bowed in their presence, knowing that divine legitimacy rested in the priest's blessing. Yet beneath the surface of this spiritual empire, ambition festered. The voice of faith had grown quiet, replaced by murmurs of greed. Among the nobles and scribes, stories began to circulate about secret gatherings within the temple where offerings vanished and divine decrees were altered to serve human purposes. Amun's name was invoked to justify every act of control, every demand for tribute. The people obeyed, believing their suffering kept the universe in balance. The light that once flowed freely through Egypt's soul had become filtered through shadowed corridors of power, where prayers turned to currency and devotion to debt. Beyond the temple gates, the Nile continued its eternal pulse, flooding the plains with abundance each year. Farmers sang hymns to Hapi, the god of the river, as they watched the fields bloom with green life. Children played in the water, unaware that their laughter was part of a cosmic rhythm believed to please the gods. Yet even in this beauty, something felt hollow. The divine had become distant, a concept guarded by walls of stone. Faith, once a living bond between heaven and earth, had hardened into ritual. Whispers began to stir among those close to the royal court. The power of the priesthood had grown vast, their reach nearly absolute. Kings had come and gone, but the temples endured, untouched and eternal. The throne, once the heart of divine authority, now stood shadowed by the sanctuaries of Amun. Pharaohs ruled in name, but the priests ruled in silence. Amid this complex world of gods and men, the seeds of change lay dormant. Egypt had achieved order, but at the cost of spirit. Those who still gazed at the sunrise might have felt a strange pull in their hearts, a quiet reminder of a purer truth, that divinity could not be contained by walls or guarded by priests. From this ancient calm, a storm would rise. A single mind born into the splendor of empire would soon challenge the foundation of all belief. The land that worshipped 1,000 gods would one day bow to one. The age before the heresy was golden, yet fragile, a mirror so polished that the smallest fracture could shatter its perfection. The old gods watched in silence, their statues unblinking as the wind of destiny began to stir across the sands. From the royal palaces of Thebes came a child unlike others. Born into privilege and divine expectation, Amenhotep IV entered the world beneath the watchful eyes of gods and courtiers. His father, Amenhotep III, ruled with splendor and confidence, his reign marked by peace, prosperity, and a devotion to tradition. The young prince was destined to inherit not just a throne, but an entire cosmos shaped by ritual and order. Yet from his earliest days, whispers surrounded him, that his spirit seemed distant, that he watched the sun too long, as if hearing something others could not. As the boy grew, courtiers noticed his quietness. While other princes joined in festivals or learned the arts of war, Amenhotep would sit near the palace walls, tracing patterns in the dust as dawn broke over the Nile. The rising sun fascinated him in ways that puzzled his tutors. He would follow its path with his eyes, from the first pale shimmer to the burning arc that crowned the sky. Servants said he would stare into its light until tears streamed down his face, yet he did not look away. To him, the sun was not simply a god to be praised, but a presence that spoke in silence. Education in the palace was strict. Priests taught him the sacred writings, the rituals of the temples, and the long line of gods who ruled over creation. He learned to recite hymns, to recognize omens, to read the language of the stars, yet his heart drifted elsewhere. Instead of the stories of Amun or Osiris, his imagination wandered toward the horizon where the sun met the earth. The other children called him strange. Even his tutors, men of wisdom and discipline, began to wonder whether he carried a spark of madness or prophecy. His mother, Queen Tai, watched him with a mixture of pride and fear. She saw the depth of his gaze, the stillness of his hands, and sensed that her son's destiny would not follow the paths of his ancestors. Legends tell that Ti, wise and strong-willed, was among the first to encourage his fascination with the sun. She whispered that the light was pure, untainted by human hands, and that perhaps within it, truth slept unseen. Those words would later ignite a revolution. Within the marble halls of his youth, Amenhotep walked between two worlds. On one side lay the golden splendor of Egypt's gods, carved in stone and celebrated in endless ceremony. On the other lay something invisible, a whisper of unity, a feeling that all things were bound by the same light. His soul seemed too vast for the narrow confines of temples and tradition. Dreams began to haunt him. He would wake before dawn, trembling, claiming to have seen the sky open, flooding the world with radiant warmth that spoke without words. He told his attendants that the light carried no faces, no names, only peace. The priests dismissed it as imagination, but in his eyes an ember had begun to glow. He grew into a man who felt both part of and apart from his own lineage. The festivals of the old gods filled him with discomfort. He watched the priests chant and dance in shadowed halls, and though the air vibrated with reverence, he sensed hollowness in the spectacle. The gods carved into stone seemed cold, lifeless, imprisoned. When he looked upon them, he saw not power, but distance. When he looked upon the sun, he saw motion, life, and warmth. Those who knew him said his silence deepened with age. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did, his words carried strange conviction, as if he spoke from another place. Something had begun to awaken within him, a dream that would soon outgrow the world that raised him. The city of Thebes pulsed like a living heart at the center of Egypt's spiritual body. Columns stretched toward the heavens, carved with the names of gods and kings, while the scent of burning incense curled through the air like invisible prayers. The temples of Amun dominated the landscape, their vast courtyards alive with song and ceremony. To the people, the priests were guardians of eternity, men who spoke for the gods. Yet behind the heavy doors of sanctuaries, a deeper reality unfolded, one woven of ambition, secrecy, and silent fear. The wealth flowing into the temple of Amun had grown immeasurable. Gold from Nubia, incense from Punt, lapis from the east, all offerings brought in the name of devotion. Yet the gods themselves never touched these treasures. They passed through mortal hands through the hidden chambers where priests counted offerings by lamplight and sealed records in scrolls. The divine had become a ledger, and holiness a form of trade. Pharaoh's palace, though glittering, stood in the shadow of this invisible empire. Even the ruler, seen as a living god, felt the weight of the priesthood pressing against his throne. Their words shaped belief. Their ceremonies bound the hearts of millions. Their temples stretched across the land like veins carrying both faith and control. The priests of Amun had become more than servants of the divine. They were its gatekeepers. Amenhotep IV, still a prince, began to sense the imbalance. He walked through the temple corridors, watching the priests at work, hearing the chants that echoed through endless halls of stone. Their voices rose in unison, but he felt no purity in them. He noticed the greed in their eyes, the arrogance in their tone. Faith, once alive, had turned mechanical. The flame of devotion had dimmed, replaced by the cold machinery of power. At night, when torches flickered against the temple walls, he would see shadows move when no footsteps sounded. The whispers of forbidden rites echoed through the darkness. Some said that deep within the temple, ceremonies unknown to the people were performed. Rituals that fed not the gods, but the ambitions of men. Those who questioned them vanished quietly. The young prince's disquiet grew. His visits to the temples became less frequent, his prayers shorter. He began to seek solitude outside the city, walking along the riverbanks at dawn. While priests invoked countless names of deities, he found himself drawn to the one constant above them all, the rising sun, unchanging, pure. He began to wonder whether the gods behind the temple walls were nothing more than reflections of human desire. Thebes, proud and radiant, was rotting from within. Its monuments gleamed, but its heart trembled under the weight of hypocrisy. Even the people sensed unease. Floods faltered, crops withered, and fear spread that the gods were angry. The priests demanded more offerings, more prayers, more obedience, but the heavens remained silent. The old order had begun to crack, though few dared to see it. Within the prince's heart, a new thought took root, that true divinity needed no temple, no priest, no sacrifice. Only the light itself was eternal, shining upon both king and beggar alike. That idea would grow until it consumed him completely, driving him to defy everything his ancestors had built. The shadows of Thebes lengthened each day, stretching across the sands like omens. Beneath their cover, the dream of a solitary god began to awaken, unseen, yet unstoppable. The sun was rising, and with it, a heresy was being born. Morning unfolded over the desert like a revelation. As dawn touched the horizon, the world seemed to breathe, and in that fragile silence between darkness and day, Amenhotep IV stood before the rising sun. The sands glowed with warmth, the river shimmered with liquid fire, and the air trembled with light so pure it seemed alive. His eyes lifted toward the blazing disk, and in that instant, everything changed. It was not a vision of gods in human form, not the thunder of divine voices or the murmur of ancient spirits. It was light itself, unshaped, unbound, all-embracing. The young Pharaoh felt it seep into his skin, a pulse that beat in rhythm with his own heart, a living truth that required no priest to interpret. That moment became the beginning of everything that followed. He felt the presence of Aten not as a being to be worshipped, but as a force that sustained all things. Each ray that reached the earth carried life, touching leaf, water, and flesh alike. The poorest farmer, the newborn child, the bird in flight, all were kissed by the same light. No temple walls could contain it, no offering could purchase it. It was infinite, beyond image, beyond the reach of human corruption. As he watched, he felt the weight of centuries lift from his soul, as if he had stepped beyond the confines of tradition and stood before the raw pulse of creation itself. Whispers began to stir through the palace when the Pharaoh began to speak of this revelation. He spoke of Aten as the one true essence behind all life, the giver of breath, the warmth that nourished the earth. His words carried a strange serenity, as though he were describing a truth too vast for language. The courtiers listened with unease. The priests, hearing of it, frowned in silence. Yet the young ruler's conviction could not be contained. He began to compose hymns to Aten, not prayers of fear or pleading, but songs of awe, gratitude, and peace. Each dawn he would rise before the city and watch the light spill over the horizon, feeling as though the sun itself spoke directly to him. Those who served near him said he would lift his hands toward the rays, as though greeting a friend, his face bathed in gold. The people began to whisper that their king had found a new god, one that needed no image, no statue, no secret name whispered in the dark. This idea was dangerous, for it threatened the foundation of everything Egypt had been built upon. Yet, to Amenhotep, it was not rebellion, it was revelation. Songs of Aten soon filled the palace halls. Musicians played in open courtyards beneath the sunlight, their melodies rising into the air like offerings of sound. The walls were adorned not with the many gods of old, but with radiant discs, whose rays reached down to touch the faces of the royal family. Every symbol turned toward the light, as if all creation was awakening. The atmosphere shifted. Shadows seemed thinner, the air more alive. The pharaoh had begun to see the world as a reflection of the divine, where every living thing carried a spark of Aten's presence. This awakening did not go unnoticed by the temples of Thebes. High priests met in secret, their voices hushed but urgent. They could not allow such teachings to spread, for they unraveled their power. If Aten was everything, then Amun was nothing. If the sun alone was divine, the temples would stand empty. Fear crept through the priesthood, and with it came resentment. But the pharaoh continued his worship openly, unafraid, his faith radiant and unshakable. Each day he withdrew further from the rituals of the old religion, choosing instead to walk in open courtyards where the sunlight fell freely. He no longer bowed before statues, he no longer entered shadowed shrines. The light of Aten was enough. His attendants began to mirror his habits, standing beside him at dawn, their faces turned toward the sun. It was as though the entire court was slowly being washed clean of centuries of superstition. A new kind of holiness filled the air, one that spoke not of fear, but of peace. The pharaoh felt reborn, as if the sun itself had chosen him to restore truth to the world. Yet within that brilliance, darkness gathered beyond sight, waiting for its moment to strike. The gods of Egypt did not surrender quietly, and their servants were already plotting in the shadows. Trumpets echoed across the sacred city as Amenhotep IV ascended the throne of Egypt. The ceremony shimmered with splendor, gold reflecting sunlight across the polished stone. Priests in white linen lined the processional path, chanting invocations to the gods of old, though even as they spoke, an unease moved through their ranks. The young pharaoh's eyes were calm, yet distant, fixed on the horizon as if he were already listening to a different song. He accepted the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, but his thoughts were far from the ancient rituals unfolding around him. Crowds gathered beneath the walls of the temple, raising their voices in praise as tradition demanded, but their ruler's stillness unsettled them. His hands, when lifted in blessing, turned not toward the idols or the hidden sanctuaries, but toward the sky. For the first time in Egypt's long history, the coronation of a pharaoh felt like a break in the divine order. The words spoken by the priests carried the weight of centuries, yet their meaning seemed to drift away into the empty air. The light that poured down upon the young king felt different, clearer, almost sentient. Within the palace, his first decrees began to reshape the kingdom in quiet, deliberate strokes. He ordered that more of the ceremonies take place under open sunlight rather than within shadowed temples. Offerings were to be made not only to the gods, but to the light that sustained life itself. Statues that once stood in dark chambers were carried out to stand beneath the sky, their gilded faces illuminated by the sun. It was an act both symbolic and defiant, and the priests watched with growing tension as the pharaoh's devotion shifted visibly from Amun to Aten. Every coronation before his had been an affirmation of divine balance, man and god, ruler and priest bound together in sacred harmony. His, however, felt like the opening of a new age. The priests whispered the word heretic in private, yet dared not speak it aloud. To the common people, he was a curious figure, a king who seemed both human and touched by something vast and unseen. His reign had begun, but no one could yet comprehend what it would unleash. Within the first months of rule, the pharaoh began to withdraw from the elaborate pageantry of the temples. He spent his mornings in gardens bathed in sunlight, writing hymns in praise of Aten, words filled with devotion yet stripped of superstition. His scribes recorded his verses which spoke of life, creation, and the unity of all things under the warmth of the sun. He declared that the divine could be felt by every soul, that no intermediary was required to reach it. To the people, this sounded like liberation. To the priesthood, it was blasphemy. Tension thickened in Thebes like gathering storm clouds. The priests of Amun tightened their control, fearing the erosion of their influence. They warned that the gods were displeased, that chaos would follow if the pharaoh continued down this path. But the ruler's faith only deepened. He believed Aten had chosen him to restore the purity of worship, to free the hearts of men from the tyranny of fear. He spoke gently, yet his conviction was unyielding. Each public ceremony became a subtle act of defiance. The old hymns were shortened, the prayers simplified. Aten's name began to appear beside those of the older gods, and before long, above them. The murals in palace corridors changed too. Instead of solemn gods seated on thrones, radiant discs shone over scenes of life and nature. The world seemed brighter, more open, but beneath that brightness tension pulsed. The pharaoh had crossed a line unseen yet irreversible. Among the people, stories spread that their ruler spoke directly to the sun. Some said he walked alone at dawn, barefoot in the sands, whispering words no one could understand. Whether truth or legend, it added to his mystique. The people began to call him the chosen of Aten, though the priests gritted their teeth at the sound of it. The coronation had not simply crowned a new ruler. It had marked the first breath of heresy. The moment arrived when words no longer sufficed. To proclaim devotion was one thing, but to become its vessel was another. Amenhotep IV, feeling the transformation within him grow impossible to ignore, gathered his court and announced that he would take a new name, one that would forever bind his soul to the light that had chosen him. He spoke it softly, but the sound rippled through the air like thunder. Akhenaten, effective for Aten. The name itself carried a vibration of purpose, the shedding of an old skin, the birth of a new identity. To rename oneself in Egypt was not a simple act, it was rebirth, the rewriting of fate. Every name was a prayer, a spell, a promise to the gods. When the pharaoh cast aside the name Amenhotep, he severed his tie to Amun, the hidden god of shadows, and declared his allegiance to the visible light. The priests who heard this announcement stood silent, masks of composure hiding their dread. To renounce Amun was to renounce centuries of divine order. It was as if the sun itself had split the world into light and darkness, and each soul would soon have to choose a side. In the palace halls, new inscriptions began to appear, each bearing his new name, each word carved with reverence. The artists, at his command, replaced symbols of the old gods with the radiant sun disk. His face was shown uplifted toward its rays, his hands open in gratitude. The transformation was not merely religious, it was cosmic. To those who watched him, Akhenaten seemed to move with a kind of peace that transcended understanding, as though he had become one with the light he worshipped. As word spread, the people of Egypt murmured in confusion. A pharaoh changing his name was not unheard of, but the reason behind it sent ripples through every heart. To turn from Amun, the most powerful god of the nation, was to challenge the foundation of reality itself. Some wondered if the king had lost his mind. Others whispered that he had seen a truth too profound for ordinary vision. Whatever the truth, the act could not be undone. The old name was dead, and with it, an era of faith was ending. Akhenaten began to speak of Aten not as a god among others, but as the source of all that existed. He claimed that the divine light flowed through every living thing, that to honor Aten was to honor life itself. To him, the sun's rays were hands that reached down to bless creation, and in their touch he felt a love beyond words. His teachings spread through his court like wildfire, igniting both devotion and fear. Artists began to craft a new visual language for this new age. Gone were the rigid depictions of gods enthroned in darkness. In their place appeared images of open skies, families bathed in sunlight, and the radiant disk hovering above them. It was art reborn, not in service of power, but of wonder. Every stroke of the chisel, every pigment of color seemed to shimmer with devotion. The king's new name shone at the heart of this transformation, a symbol of awakening that refused to fade. Within the temples, the priests of Amun fumed in silence. Their influence was slipping, their authority questioned. To erase a god from Egypt's heart was unthinkable, yet the pharaoh had begun to do just that. In every decree, in every hymn, Aten rose higher, while Amun's name began to vanish from inscriptions, chiseled away as though it had never existed. The age of hidden gods was dissolving beneath the light of a single sun. Each morning, as Akhenaten stood upon his balcony and greeted the dawn, he whispered his new name to the wind, as though reaffirming a vow. The rays touched his face like a blessing, and he smiled, certain that the light had chosen him for something beyond comprehension. The air shimmered with destiny, and the world, though still bound by old beliefs, could not help but feel the pull of his conviction. From that moment, Egypt's path was forever altered. The sun had been given a name, and in that name the shadows began to tremble. Whispers of change drifted through the royal city like desert wind moving through reeds. Akhenaten, now fully devoted to Aten, sought to create not only a new religion, but a new order, a secret brotherhood devoted entirely to the pure light. He gathered a circle of chosen men and women, those who shared his vision, or who had glimpsed, even faintly, the mystery of Aten's presence. They met not within the shadows of temples, but beneath open skies, where sunlight fell freely upon their faces. No idols adorned their gatherings, no incense clouded the air. Only the golden rays of morning stretching over the land served as witness to their devotion. In this brotherhood, words were few, for silence was seen as the truest form of reverence. They believed that the divine could not be captured by speech, only experienced in stillness. The rituals they performed were unlike any seen before in Egypt. No sacrifices were made, no offerings burned, no idols kissed. Instead, they lifted their hands toward the rising sun, eyes closed, feeling the warmth upon their skin as if touched by eternity itself. To them, Aten was not a god confined to form, but a living current of life that flowed through all creation. Within this hidden circle, Akhenaten shared his revelations in quiet tones. He spoke of light as consciousness, of existence as unity, and of man's purpose as recognition of that unity. The priests of Aten were few in number, chosen for purity of heart rather than birth or status. Each was sworn to secrecy, bound by vows of silence concerning the deeper mysteries revealed to them. They studied the patterns of light upon water, the movement of the stars, the cycle of dawn and dusk, searching for divine messages hidden in plain sight. Hymns were composed that spoke not to gods of vengeance or favor, but to the eternal brilliance that gave life to all things. They sang at sunrise when the horizon glowed with pale fire, and at sunset when the light softened into memory. Their songs echoed through the courtyards like prayers without fear. To outsiders, they appeared peaceful, detached from worldly affairs. Yet beneath their calm exterior, they guarded a secret understanding, that true divinity was not above man, but within him. As the order grew in influence, rumors began to swirl among those who still followed the old gods. The priests of Amun called them blasphemers, sorcerers who sought to steal the gods' power for themselves. But Akhenaten's followers ignored the accusations. They believed their task was sacred, to awaken humanity to the truth hidden beneath centuries of superstition. They saw themselves as keepers of the sun's secret, chosen to guard its purity from the corruption of idols. The teachings of Aten spread quietly through Egypt, carried not by conquest but by example. Farmers began to greet the morning light with open palms, fishermen offered their first catch to the sun instead of the temples, and craftsmen carved images of the radiant disk over their doorways for protection. Faith was slipping from the control of the priesthood, flowing once more into the hearts of the people. Within the palace, Akhenaten established sanctuaries without roofs, where sunlight could pour directly onto the altars. He declared that divine worship should never hide beneath stone. The sacred spaces of Aten were filled with air and light, not darkness and smoke. Every design, every angle of architecture reflected his devotion to openness. Walls were carved with scenes of life, not death, of families, not gods. Faith had become human again, grounded in warmth rather than fear. Each member of the hidden order carried within them a secret conviction that their work would endure beyond their lifetimes. They believed that one day, when all the idols had turned to dust, the world would awaken to the same truth, that light itself was divine and all life its reflection. Though their faith was quiet, it burned brighter than any flame. Beneath the surface of Egypt's splendor, an invisible revolution was unfolding, radiant and unstoppable. Among the golden corridors of Akhenaten's new faith walked a woman whose presence seemed to embody the very light he worshipped. Nefertiti, his queen, was more than consort or ornament of the court. She was his mirror, his equal, his divine counterpart. Her name, meaning the beautiful one has come, echoed through history like a song, but her true beauty was not in her face alone. It was in the calm power she radiated, the grace with which she carried the Pharaoh's vision as her own. Together, they became the living symbols of the sun's union with the earth, of divine light joined with human form. In the early mornings, she would stand beside Akhenaten as he greeted the dawn. The two were often seen together in open courtyards, their hands raised toward the glowing disk that crowned the sky. Artists captured these moments in limestone and paint, their profiles bathed in rays that descended from Aten, touching their faces and their daughters with small, tender hands of light. To the people, this image became a revelation, for never before had Egypt seen its royal family depicted with such warmth. such humanity. The Pharaoh and his queen were not distant deities enthroned above men, but parents, lovers, and servants of a shared faith. Nefertiti's influence extended far beyond the palace walls. She understood the power of image, the silent language of beauty that could reach the hearts of her people more deeply than words. Her likeness appeared everywhere, on temple walls, in jewelry, on the columns of new sanctuaries dedicated to Aten. Her beauty became synonymous with divine favor, her poise with celestial harmony. Where she walked, courtiers lowered their eyes not out of fear, but reverence. She was the embodiment of Akhenaten's dream made flesh. Together they ruled not as two monarchs, but as one radiant force. While Akhenaten spoke of unity, Nefertiti embodied it. Her wisdom softened his zeal, her compassion tempered his idealism. She listened when others hesitated to speak, and her counsel often guided the pharaoh's hand. Many within the court believed that without her, his vision would have burned too fiercely, consuming everything it touched. With her beside him, it became balanced, almost gentle, a light that nourished rather than scorched. Art during their reign transformed into a reflection of their bond. Gone were the rigid poses and divine perfection of earlier dynasties. In their place appeared scenes of intimacy. The royal couple, seated together beneath Aten's rays, their children playing at their feet, laughter etched into stone. Such depictions had never graced Egyptian temples before. Through their image, they taught that divinity was not remote, but present in love, family, and the daily act of living. Nefertiti's faith in Aten was not mere loyalty to her husband, it was devotion of her own. She too had felt the sun's warmth, the purity of its presence. Her voice joined his in hymns, her hands lifted in prayer beside his. People began to call her the Mistress of Radiance, believing she too channeled the power of Aten. In public ceremonies, when she stood beside Akhenaten, the light seemed to gather around her like a halo. To those who witnessed it, she appeared as more than queen. She was a vessel of light itself. Under her influence, women in Egypt found new strength. The queen's prominence inspired change, as priestesses and noblewomen began to hold greater authority within the temples of Aten. Her grace became a symbol of renewal, her name a prayer whispered at sunrise. Where she went, she carried the warmth of a new age, her presence silencing doubt, her smile bridging heaven and earth. Together, Akhenaten and Nefertiti seemed unstoppable, twin flames illuminating a world that had forgotten its soul. Yet, even as they basked in the radiance of their faith, shadows gathered beyond the horizon. The old gods, stripped of worship, had not been forgotten, and their priests were watching, waiting. But for that moment in time, beneath the open sky of Egypt, love and light ruled together, and the world shimmered in their glow. From the heart of his revelation, Akhenaten envisioned a city unlike any that had ever existed, a city built not for man or empire, but for light. He named it Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. It would rise upon a stretch of untouched desert between Thebes and Memphis, where no god had ever been worshipped, no temple yet defiled by shadow. There, he believed, Aten's rays would fall pure and unbroken, illuminating a world free from the corruption of the old order. It was to be both sanctuary and statement, a living monument to the unity of creation. The command went forth, and thousands of workers set out across the sands to carve the pharaoh's dream into reality. Stone by stone, the city began to rise beneath the blazing sky. The sound of chisels echoed against the cliffs, mingling with the hum of wind and the distant song of the Nile. Streets were laid in straight lines to catch the morning light, courtyards opened toward the east so that no dawn would pass unnoticed. The entire city was designed to breathe with the rhythm of the sun, to awaken and sleep in harmony with its path. In the heart of this vast creation stood the great temple of Aten, open to the heavens, its altars unroofed. Sunlight poured directly onto the sacred spaces, unfiltered and uncontained. The people could stand in its presence, feeling its warmth upon their skin without barrier or mediator. There were no statues of gods, no chambers for hidden rituals. Only the disk of the sun above and the living world below, united in light. Nefertiti oversaw the adornment of the new palaces, ensuring that every surface reflected Aten's brilliance. Walls were painted in soft gold and ochre tones, depicting families, harvests, and the unbroken flow of life. Artists worked tirelessly, capturing the vitality of existence rather than its grandeur. Each brushstroke seemed alive, as if touched by sunlight itself. The city gleamed like a vision, its stones glowing with warmth, as if they had absorbed the fire of the sun. As the royal family moved to their new home, the exodus from Thebes began. The priests of Amun watched with fury as their influence waned. Temples that had thrived for centuries were left empty, their offerings dwindling. The capital, once the center of divine power, had been abandoned for the desert's horizon. The message was clear: the age of Amun was fading, and the age of Aten had begun. To those who lived in Akhenaten, each day felt like a hymn. The city awoke with the dawn, its inhabitants greeting the first light with song. Farmers worked under the open sky, craftsmen shaped stone in the glow of midday, and as the sun set, the city seemed to sigh in peace. Faith had become tangible, woven into the rhythm of life itself. No walls separated the divine from the human, no priest stood between man and the sun. Yet behind the splendor, murmurs persisted. The old cities whispered that their gods had been betrayed. Traders from foreign lands called the new capital a city of madness, a place where even the gods were silent. But for Akhenaten, these doubts mattered little. He saw Akhenaten as a promise fulfilled, the horizon of his vision made real. The people would walk in the light, unafraid, and the divine would dwell among them, not in image, but in radiance. Each dawn that rose over the desert reaffirmed his faith. Standing upon his balcony, Akhenaten would gaze across the city he had summoned from the sands and feel as though he had brought heaven to earth. The horizon glowed like molten gold, the light sweeping over roofs, statues, and fields until everything shone as one. In that brilliance, he saw the reflection of his own soul, vast, luminous, eternal. Within the radiant walls of Akhenaten, a revolution unfolded not only in faith, but in form. Art, once chained to solemn symmetry and divine perfection, awoke to new life under Akhenaten's rule. For centuries, Egyptian artists had carved their gods and kings as unyielding figures, flawless and eternal, untouched by the imperfections of flesh. Now the Pharaoh commanded that truth should replace grandeur, that life itself, with its movement, its tenderness, its breath, should be honored as sacred. This decree changed everything. Chisels struck softer against stone, guided not by rigid measure but by feeling. Painters mixed their pigments with greater care, layering warmth into faces and curves into bodies. The walls of temples and palaces began to tell human stories. The Pharaoh holding his daughters in his arms, Nefertiti gazing upward as sunlight touched her face, the royal children laughing beneath the rays of Aten. These were not scenes of distant divinity, but moments of living grace, where holiness and humanity intertwined. Akhenaten believed that to worship Aten was to celebrate the beauty of creation itself. He saw no separation between art and prayer, for every line drawn, every color applied, was an act of devotion. His vision called for an honesty that startled those accustomed to the rigid order of old Egypt. Artists were encouraged to see, not merely to depict. They studied the way light fell upon water, how it revealed the veins of leaves and the softness of human skin. In their work, they sought the same purity that the Pharaoh found in the sun's rays. Portraits of Akhenaten himself began to reflect this philosophy. His face was elongated, his body slender, his features almost androgynous. Gone was the sculpted perfection of divine kingship. In its place appeared a man both fragile and radiant. To the court, it was bewildering. Some thought it mockery, others revelation. But to those who understood, it represented truth, the merging of man and God, mortal and divine, bound by the same light that sustained all life. Nefertiti's image, too, transformed into something beyond beauty. Her likeness appeared not as ornament, but as essence. Artists captured her serenity, her subtle smile, her gaze fixed always toward the sun. In their hands, she became the symbol of living light, the embodiment of harmony and balance. Her face was sculpted not to please but to teach, to remind those who looked upon her that love and faith could share the same breath. Within workshops of Akhenaten, young apprentices learned a new creed. They were told to see truth in movement, to let emotion guide their craft. Walls once filled with scenes of conquest and power now depicted laughter, music, and touch. Even the gods were portrayed not as distant overseers, but as presence itself, invisible, yet everywhere. Aten was no longer an object of art, but its source, its illumination. As the new style flourished, ambassadors from foreign lands arrived at the Horizon City, astonished by what they saw. The art seemed alive, as if the figures might step from the walls and speak. Light shimmered across the surfaces, making the scenes appear to breathe. Egypt, once bound by timeless formality, had discovered the soul of expression. What had begun as faith had become an awakening of creation. Through art, Akhenaten's dream took visible shape. Every color, every carving, every hymn etched into stone reflected his conviction that divinity lived not above, but within. The people who walked through his city no longer saw gods of judgment staring down at them. They saw themselves illuminated by the same light that shone on kings. The world had never looked so alive. As the city of Akhenaten thrived under Aten's golden gaze, a new kind of music rose from its temples. No longer did voices chant in shadowed chambers filled with incense smoke. Instead, hymns were sung beneath the open sky, carried upon warm winds that swept through courtyards and fields alike. These songs, written by the Pharaoh himself, were unlike any prayers Egypt had ever known. They did not beg nor praise out of fear. They rejoiced. They were poems of gratitude, love letters to the light. Akhenaten would rise before dawn, sitting in silence as the horizon began to glow. The first rays touched the desert, and he would begin to compose in rhythm with the earth's awakening. His words spoke not of divine mystery, but of simple wonder, of rivers shimmering under morning light, of flowers opening their petals to the warmth, of life itself breathing in harmony. Each line carried the same message, that all creation was one, united beneath Aten's brilliance. The great hymn to Aten became the crown of these compositions. It was sung by priests of the new faith at sunrise and sunset, echoing across the city as though the very stones joined in the song. The words described Aten as the source of all breath, the pulse within every living being. They told of his light reaching across distant lands, touching foreign peoples who did not know his name, yet lived by his grace. It was faith without borders, light without boundary. Those who heard these hymns felt their hearts shift. They no longer imagined gods locked within statues or hidden behind temple walls. The divine was everywhere, in the cry of a newborn, in the sweep of wings over the Nile, in the shimmer of heat upon the sand. The hymns spoke to something that all could feel, but few had dared to name. It was as though Akhenaten had given voice to the silence that lived within every soul. Scribes recorded the songs carefully upon papyrus, their ink glistening in the sun. They copied them onto temple walls so that generations yet unborn might read the words and remember the light that once united all things. These texts were unlike the rigid prayers of the past. They moved with rhythm and tenderness, flowing like the river they so often praised. They were not commandments, but invitations to see, to feel, to awaken. Across Akhenaten, workers and families began to sing fragments of the hymns during their daily labors. Fishermen hummed them while casting nets, mothers whispered them to their children, and builders sang as they raised new walls. The music of Aten became the pulse of the city, blending human voice with natural rhythm until faith became indistinguishable from life. Foreign visitors wrote of this strange harmony, describing a place where worship felt like joy rather than duty. The hymns, though born of royal inspiration, belonged to everyone. They carried no threats of punishment, no pleas for mercy, only wonder and gratitude. Under Akhenaten's vision, music itself became divine communication, a bridge between heaven and earth, made of sound and breath. As the sun descended each evening, the last verses of the hymns were sung in quiet reverence. The city glowed in fading light, and for a few moments every face turned westward, eyes soft, lips murmuring the same words, that the sun would return, that light never truly dies. The songs of Aten bound the people not through law, but through shared awe, reminding them that even in darkness, the warmth of creation remained. Peace cannot exist without shadow, and even the brightest sun casts its own darkness. As the years passed in Akhenaten, the glow that had once seemed eternal began to dim around its edges. The Nile's floods grew uncertain, the harvests less plentiful. Whispers spread that the gods of old were displeased, that their silence had turned to wrath. Among the people, doubt crept like a chill wind through the golden streets. The priests of Aten reassured them that the light remained steadfast, yet fear does not yield to reason easily. Within the abandoned temples of Thebes, the old priesthood stirred once more. The followers of Amun, long humiliated and stripped of power, met in secret chambers deep beneath the city. There they spoke of vengeance, of restoring balance to the world that Akhenaten had broken. Offerings began to appear again before the ancient idols, small at first, then more frequent. The flame of the old gods, though dimmed, refused to die. Messengers loyal to Amun's priests infiltrated Akhenaten, spreading rumors among the citizens. They claimed the drought was punishment, that Aten had no power to bless the fields or guide the river. Fear took root in the hearts of farmers who watched their crops wither beneath the unrelenting heat. For all its beauty, the horizon city was fragile, built upon faith as delicate as glass. And now that faith began to tremble, Akhenaten, lost within his devotion, saw the signs but did not waver. To him, every trial was a test, every hardship a purification. He believed the people's doubt stemmed from their lingering ties to false gods, that only through absolute faith in Aten could Egypt be reborn. His certainty, once his greatest strength, now blinded him to the storm gathering around him. He prayed longer, withdrew further, seeking counsel not from his advisers, but from the light itself. Nefertiti watched in silence as her husband drifted away from the world of men. She had shared his faith, had lived within his dream, but she felt the tension rising within the city. The joy that once filled the courtyards had grown brittle. Eyes that once looked to the sun in wonder now turned to it in desperation. The songs of Aten still echoed, but their tone had changed, reverence tinged with pleading. Within the palace walls food grew scarcer. Workers began to whisper of omens, of spirits wandering the desert. The people who had once praised the Pharaoh now spoke of madness, of a king who loved the sun more than his own people. The harmony between ruler and nation was unraveling thread by thread. Beyond the city's borders, ambassadors returned from foreign lands with troubling news. Neighboring kingdoms viewed Akhenaten's isolation as weakness. Trade routes began to falter. Allies grew distant. Even within Egypt's borders, governors and generals murmured their doubts. The horizon city, radiant and pure, stood like an island surrounded by an ocean of unrest. Yet still, each morning, Akhenaten greeted the dawn with open hands, convinced that light alone could heal all wounds. The priests of Aten sang louder, their hymns more desperate, their smiles tighter. Beneath the brilliance of the sun, cracks widened unseen. What had begun as revelation was slipping into rigidity. The light had become so blinding that it obscured the shadows it cast. And as the sun blazed above Akhenaten, those shadows deepened, waiting, silent, patient, beneath the city of light. Night crept upon Akhenaten with a stillness that felt unnatural. The city built upon faith and sunlight now hid fears that whispered through its empty corridors. Beneath the endless gaze of Aten, people began to lower their eyes. Messengers vanished between outposts. Farmers spoke in hushed voices about the priests of Amun returning to power in distant cities. The silence that once symbolized peace had become the quiet before a storm. Faith was no longer a flame that warmed, but one that burned. In the heart of the royal palace, Akhenaten continued his rituals, oblivious to the shifting winds. He believed that doubt itself was the enemy, that disbelief was darkness clawing at the soul. His isolation deepened. Courtiers who once walked freely through the gardens now waited in fear to be summoned. Those who questioned him were dismissed or vanished altogether, their names erased from the records as though they had never lived. What had once been a kingdom of light was becoming a realm of silence. Within the secret halls of the temples, old idols reappeared like ghosts. Hidden beneath cloth, they waited for hands brave enough to light the incense once more. Priests who had once fled from Akhenaten's reforms began to gather their followers again, whispering that the time of Aten was ending. By torchlight they read ancient hymns and promised the people that the true gods would soon reclaim Egypt. The rebellion was not shouted from rooftops, it breathed quietly in the shadows, patient and precise. Among the workers of Akhenaten, unrest began to stir. Food grew scarce, wages were delayed, and the city's grand vision began to crumble beneath the weight of discontent. Murmurs spread through the streets like sand carried by wind, that the Pharaoh had angered the gods, that Aten had turned his face away. Families who once sang hymns at sunrise now prayed in secret to Amun, fearing both their ruler's wrath and divine retribution. Akhenaten's priests tried to restore control through sermons and ceremony, but faith cannot be commanded. Each decree demanding loyalty to Aten only deepened resentment. Even those closest to the Pharaoh began to waver. Advisors avoided his gaze, their loyalty eroded by fear and hunger. Behind every act of devotion grew a shadow of doubt, behind every smile a trace of despair. Rumors reached the palace that soldiers in the south had begun to swear allegiance to the old gods. The pharaoh's emissaries were intercepted, their messages never delivered. The empire was fracturing, and yet Akhenaten continued to gaze at the horizon each morning, convinced that the light would save him. He refused to see that his creation had become fragile, that the dream built upon sunlight was collapsing into dust. Those who still loved him, the few who believed his vision had once been pure, could do nothing. To speak against him was to be cast into oblivion, yet to obey was to join a sinking ship. The people moved through their days like shadows, their voices trapped within them. Egypt, for all its sunlight, had grown darker than it had ever been. One night, a group of men gathered in secret at the edge of the desert. They carried no banners, only silence. Their plan was not to strike immediately, but to wait, to let the weight of the pharaoh's faith crush itself. They knew that power built upon devotion could not be overthrown by violence alone. It would have to collapse under its own radiance. And so the rebellion grew, not in open fire, but in whispers beneath the sand. Within the golden chambers of the palace, a presence vanished like a breath in the wind. Nefertiti, once the living emblem of grace and light, was gone. No proclamation announced her passing, no ceremony marked her absence. Her image, once carved upon every wall, began to fade from the reliefs of Akhenaten. Where once her figure stood beside the pharaoh, rays of Aten caressing her face, now there was only empty space. Egypt, in its silence, began to murmur. The reasons for her disappearance remain veiled in mystery. Some believed she had fallen ill, others that she had been banished for questioning Akhenaten's growing fanaticism. There were whispers that she had not died at all, but retreated into seclusion, living under another name to escape the madness consuming her husband's vision. Whatever truth hid behind the veils, her absence felt like the dimming of the sun itself. Without her, Akhenaten changed. The gentle warmth that once softened his eyes turned into a cold glare fixed on the heavens. He no longer shared his meals with courtiers, no longer walked through the gardens singing hymns to Aten. He spoke less to men and more to the light above, as if waiting for it to speak back. Nefertiti had been the voice of balance, the bridge between human love and divine purpose. Without her, that balance fractured. Artists who had once immortalized her beauty found their work halted. Her statues were taken down, her name scraped from inscriptions. The queen, who had embodied harmony, became a forbidden memory. Only fragments remained, a broken bust here, a faded mural there, as if the world itself could not decide whether to forget her or to mourn her. The people who had adored her wept in silence, for even grief had become dangerous. Rumors spread through the city that she had defied her husband's divine decrees, pleading with him to show mercy to the people. They said her voice had trembled with love, not defiance, yet his heart had grown too rigid to hear. Some believed she left willingly, unable to watch the faith they had built together twist into something unrecognizable. Others whispered that she had been taken by the priests, either as a hostage or a sacrifice to appease forgotten gods. Within the palace, her absence echoed through every hall. Servants avoided speaking her name, yet her presence lingered in every ray of sunlight that fell across the floor. Akhenaten's prayers grew louder, his isolation deeper. To the people he seemed haunted, not by enemies, but by memory. Each dawn he rose to greet Aten, yet the light no longer touched him with warmth. It fell cold upon his skin, reflecting a brilliance he could no longer feel. In art that followed her disappearance, her image became ethereal, a silhouette of perfection that no longer belonged to the world. Sculptors began to depict her not as queen, but as spirit drifting between heaven and earth. Some believed she had become part of Aten's eternal light, transcending mortality to guide the Pharaoh from afar. To others, she was a ghost, her departure marking the moment Egypt began to lose its soul. Without her, Akhenaten grew quiet. The laughter of children that once filled the courtyards faded. The songs that had once praised both king and queen now sounded hollow, incomplete. Faith had lost its heart, and devotion had become an echo. The woman who had walked beside the sun had vanished, leaving behind only silence and shadows. Within the waning light of Akhenaten's glory, a child watched the world through eyes too young to understand its decline. Tutankhaten, the son of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, grew up surrounded by sunlight and silence. He was a prince of the new faith, taught from birth that Aten alone sustained life. Each morning he was brought before his father to lift his small hands toward the horizon, mimicking the gestures of worship he barely comprehended. The golden rays that warmed his skin were the only gods he knew. Tutors instructed him in hymns rather than laws, teaching him that truth resided in the light and that shadows were deceit. Yet as he grew, questions stirred within him. He heard servants whisper names that were forbidden: Amun, Osiris, Isis, words spoken with fear and longing. He noticed how the adults hesitated when they passed the statues of Aten, how their eyes darted toward hidden corners as if searching for something lost. The purity he had been taught began to feel fragile, like glass ready to shatter. Life within the palace had become heavy with secrecy. The walls that once glowed with color seemed pale and worn, the gardens quiet except for the rustle of wind through the reeds. His father's presence filled every hall, yet he felt more distant than ever. Akhenaten spoke little to his son, addressing him not as a child, but as a vessel of the future, one who would continue the sacred truth. But to Tutankhaten, his father seemed unreachable, a figure consumed by visions that no longer touched the world around him. He watched from afar as priests of Aten continued their ceremonies, their movements mechanical, their hymns drained of joy. What had once been vibrant now felt forced, like actors performing beneath a sun that refused to listen. The prince sensed that something immense was breaking, though he could not name it. Faith, once radiant, had begun to flicker. Outside the palace, Egypt itself was changing. Messengers returned with news of unrest, of soldiers deserting their posts, of temples reopening in secret. The people had begun to rebuild altars to the old gods, not out of defiance, but out of fear. To them, Aten's light no longer offered comfort. It burned without mercy. The boy listened as attendants whispered that the world beyond Akhenaten had grown hungry, restless, unmoored. Within his chambers, he found himself drawn to the relics his mother had left behind, small figures of forgotten deities hidden carefully among her belongings. He would trace his fingers over their shapes, feeling something stir within him that he did not understand. It was not rebellion, but recognition, as though a voice from deep within the past called to him through the silence. Those who watched him began to see a gentleness that reminded them of Nefertiti. He possessed her quiet thoughtfulness, her balance between faith and compassion. The priests who taught him grew uneasy, sensing a questioning spirit that could not be silenced. Yet he was obedient, outwardly faithful, waiting for the world around him to reveal its truth. Each morning, as he lifted his eyes toward Aten, the prince felt both devotion and doubt. The light that touched him felt warm but distant, beautiful yet lonely. Somewhere beyond the walls of Akhenaten, he sensed that another world waited, one that still remembered the gods his father had tried to erase. The seeds of restoration had begun to grow quietly within the heart of a child, the last heir to a fading sun. Desert winds swept across the once golden streets of Akhenaten, carrying with them the faint sound of crumbling stone. The city that had been built as a hymn to light was sinking into silence. Its open courtyards, once filled with song, now stood empty under a merciless sun. Paint faded from the walls, statues cracked under heat, and the scent of decay replaced that of incense and lotus. The dream that had risen from the desert sands was dissolving back into them. Akhenaten walked among the ruins of his vision, his eyes hollow yet unwavering. To him, the city's decline was not defeat, but purification, a trial sent by Aten to test devotion. He believed that faith must endure beyond prosperity, that light still reigned even when all around seemed lost. Yet his words fell like dust upon the ears of those who remained. The people, once radiant in belief, now moved through the streets with eyes averted, their prayers whispered to unseen gods once more. Famine began to gnaw at the city's heart. The Nile's flood had failed again, leaving fields barren and granaries half empty. Hunger turned reverence into resentment. Laborers refused to work. Priests abandoned the temples. Even the soldiers guarding the city gates muttered of omens and curses. Rumors of rebellion grew louder beyond the horizon, carried by merchants and travelers who spoke of Thebes rising once more in honor of Amun. What had been a sanctuary of truth had become a prison of faith. Within the royal palace, the halls echoed with emptiness. The laughter of the royal daughters had faded, replaced by the distant cry of the wind. Servants vanished in the night, their loyalty traded for food and safety. Akhenaten, withdrawn from council, continued his rituals beneath the open sky, his skin burned by endless hours of worship. Those who still attended him did so in silence, their faces marked by fear and pity. To them, their king seemed more spirit than man, a figure consumed by his own light. Nefertiti's absence haunted every room. Her image, once the soul of the city, lingered like a ghost in the mosaics and carvings that remained untouched. Without her presence, no balance remained to temper the pharaoh's divine obsession. The softness that had once accompanied the dawn had been replaced by an austere brilliance that blinded rather than comforted. Faith had turned from warmth to fire, consuming those who drew near. Beyond the city walls, travelers spoke of temples to Aten being looted, of villages renouncing the new god, and of priests of Amun reclaiming their shrines. Egypt's unity, once unshakable, fractured into factions of faith. Akhenaten refused to send armies, believing violence would defile the purity of his vision. Yet in his restraint lay ruin, for the old powers gathered strength unopposed. His refusal to see the world's decay became its final invitation. Within Akhenaten, artisans ceased their work. The sculptures that once gleamed with vitality now lay unfinished, faces frozen in half-formed expressions of serenity. Paintings peeled under the relentless heat, their colors dulled to ash. The city seemed to hold its breath, caught between life and oblivion. Every dawn arrived like an echo of former glory, its beauty marred by emptiness. As famine tightened its grip, the people began to flee. Families walked through the desert carrying what little remained, guided by instinct rather than faith. Behind them, the city shimmered in the distance, a mirage of hope that had turned to sorrow. Akhenaten watched them leave, unblinking, convinced that those who stayed were the chosen few. Yet the chosen grew fewer each day. His kingdom of light was vanishing into dust, and still he prayed to the horizon as though it might answer. Each sunset burned red across the cliffs, staining the stones with the color of blood. The priests of Aten continued their hymns, their voices brittle and hollow against the growing wind. They sang of unity while their world fell apart around them. Akhenaten, the horizon of the sun, had become a graveyard of dreams, radiant, silent, and forsaken beneath the very light that once promised salvation. Twilight settled over the fading city like a shroud. Within the quiet chambers of his palace, Akhenaten lay frail and motionless, his body worn thin by years of devotion and solitude. The great light he had worshipped seemed to have turned away, leaving him bathed not in radiance, but in shadow. Yet his eyes remained fixed upon the window, where the last rays of sunset poured through, gilding the walls with dying gold. It was there, between light and darkness, that his breath began to slow. No court gathered, no priest stood beside him in prayer. His attendants, too few and too weary, watched from a distance as their Pharaoh whispered to the fading light. Words spilled from his lips, fragments of hymns, pleas, memories, until even those dissolved into silence. To those who witnessed his final moments, it seemed as though he was speaking to someone unseen, answering a voice only he could hear. Outside, the desert wind carried the sound of shifting sand. The city that had once celebrated the dawn now mourned the dusk. The temples stood empty, their altars cracked, their inscriptions half erased. The people who remained gathered quietly in the streets, not to mourn their king, but to watch the horizon one last time. The sun, once his eternal companion, slipped beneath the edge of the world without pause, leaving only a line of amber fire across the sky. Within the palace, his body was prepared in secrecy. Those who still followed Aten feared that if the priests of Amun learned of his death, his remains would be desecrated. They wrapped him in fine linen and sealed his features beneath layers of gold leaf, whispering his name as they worked. Yet even in burial, controversy surrounded him. Where would the heretic be laid to rest? No temple of the old gods would accept him, and the great tombs of his ancestors had long been closed to his bloodline. A small procession departed the city under cover of night, carrying the body through the desert. No torches burned, no hymns rose to the heavens. Only the steady rhythm of footsteps and the whisper of the wind accompanied the Pharaoh on his final journey. It was said that the stars shone brighter that night, as though the sky itself had opened to watch. Whether he was buried within the cliffs of Akhenaten or taken elsewhere has never been known. His tomb, like his truth, vanished into mystery. Back in the city, silence settled like dust over everything he had built. The altars of Aten grew cold, the priests fled or were slain, and the murals that once glowed with life faded beneath neglect. His name began to be struck from inscriptions, his face chiseled from walls. To speak of him became a crime. The dream of a single god, once bright as dawn, had been cast into the shadows of history. Those who remembered him did so in secret, preserving fragments of his hymns, small symbols of the radiant disk hidden in their homes. For them, Akhenaten had not been a tyrant or a fool, but a seeker who reached too far, a man who tried to touch eternity and was burned by it. To others, he was blasphemer, destroyer, one who brought Egypt to the brink of ruin. Yet all agreed that his light had changed the world, if only for a fleeting moment. Each morning after his passing, the sun still rose over Akhenaten. Its light spilled upon the broken walls, the empty streets, the forgotten altars. The city, though dying, still glimmered faintly, as if reluctant to surrender its soul. The same rays that had once crowned him now fell upon sand and ruin, indifferent and eternal. Life continued, as it always had, beneath the gaze of the same unblinking sun that had witnessed the rise and fall of the heretic king. Those who walked through the remnants of his vision felt both awe and sorrow. They knew that time would erase the marks of his reign, that the desert would swallow the horizon city whole. Yet for a moment, as the dawn stretched across the dunes, it seemed that his dream still lingered, not in stone, nor in memory, but in light itself, drifting endlessly across the sands of Egypt. Dawn broke over the Nile with a silence that carried both mourning and rebirth. The heretic king was gone, and Egypt began to breathe again, though its breath was heavy with confusion. Across the land, temples long abandoned reopened their doors. Smoke once more curled into the heavens, carrying prayers to the gods who had been banished. Amun's name, chiseled away from countless walls, was spoken again in reverence, his priests emerging from the shadows with eyes bright from vindication. The light that had once belonged to Aten now shone upon idols and altars that seemed reborn from the ashes of heresy. Akhenaten, the young prince of the sun, was brought forth as Pharaoh, yet his youth made him malleable clay in the hands of those who sought to reclaim power. Advisers and priests surrounded him, whispering that Egypt's suffering had been punishment for his father's defiance. They urged him to restore the old ways, to return to the embrace of Amun and the pantheon of the gods. The boy who had been raised beneath the open sky now watched as veiled statues returned to their sanctuaries, as the sunlight he had once worshipped grew filtered again through incense and stone. The first act of restoration came with his new name, Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. With that single gesture, the legacy of Akhenaten was buried beneath the weight of divine tradition. The priests rejoiced, their chants once again filling the air of Thebes. Gold flowed back into the temples, offerings filled the altars, and the people, weary of famine and fear, turned gratefully to the gods they understood. The order that had been shattered began to reassemble, though beneath its polished surface the memory of Aten's light flickered faintly, unresolved. Akhenaten, the city of the horizon, was abandoned. The royal court fled its empty streets, leaving behind shattered statues and sun-bleached murals. Sand crept through doorways, filling the once sacred courtyards where hymns to the living sun had echoed. Workers stripped the city of its treasures, carrying its stones to other temples, its images defaced, its glory erased. The land reclaimed what man had tried to elevate beyond nature. What had been built to honor eternity lasted scarcely a generation. Tutankhamun's reign, though brief, became a symbol of restoration. The people rejoiced under festivals for the old gods, their faith reignited not by revelation, but by relief. Processions once again wound through the streets of Thebes, the scent of lotus and myrrh returning to the air. The pharaoh and his young queen were paraded as symbols of divine harmony, living proof that Egypt had been forgiven. The priests declared that the balance of Ma'at had been restored, that the gods had returned to their rightful thrones. Yet beneath their triumph, an unease lingered, for though the idols gleamed, the sky above them remained unchanged, the same endless sun watching with silent judgment. Across the temples, scribes worked tirelessly to erase Akhenaten's memory from every monument. His name was struck from the records, his statues destroyed or buried beneath rubble. Even his image on the walls of tombs was defaced, his face scraped away by hammer and chisel. The act of forgetting became sacred duty, the rewriting of history a kind of exorcism. To remember him was dangerous, to speak his name was heresy reborn. Yet no matter how deeply the priests carved over his legacy, the traces of his truth remained, faint but indelible, like the ghost of light beneath layers of paint. Tutankhamun, though crowned in glory, grew troubled as he matured. The stories whispered through the palace halls spoke of his father not as a monster, but as a visionary. Servants who had once lived in Akhenaten told of a world where beauty and peace had flourished, where no blood was spilled in worship. The young Pharaoh began to question what had truly been lost and what had merely been hidden. He performed the rituals, wore the crown of the old faith, but his eyes, when he looked toward the horizon, seemed to search for something beyond the temple's walls. In distant sanctuaries, a few of the former priests of Aten still gathered in secret. They spoke quietly of unity, of the single light that transcended all forms. To them, Akhenaten had not failed. He had revealed what the world was not yet ready to see. Their devotion became less of worship and more of remembrance. They did not seek to rebuild his empire only to keep the flame alive, waiting for the day when it might rise again in another form. As the years passed, the great empire resumed its splendor, yet beneath its surface, the echo of Akhenaten persisted like an unhealed scar. Those who stood beneath the blazing sun could not help but recall that once a man had dared to call it divine. The priests of Amun might control the temples, but the light still belonged to no one. It shone upon ruins and palaces alike, indifferent and eternal, bearing silent witness to the cycle of devotion and denial that had defined Egypt's soul. Beneath the sands of Egypt, time swallowed cities whole, yet not all memory vanished. Deep within tombs and forgotten chambers, fragments of hymns to Aten remained etched in stone, untouched by the chisels of those who sought to erase them. Scholars and scribes centuries later would find these words, their meaning still alive with quiet defiance. The voice of Akhenaten, though silenced by decree, had survived in whispers, a murmur of light carried through the ages. In the years following Tutankhamun's death, the empire fell into disarray. Kings rose and vanished like stars, swallowed by dawn, and with each passing generation, the lines between history and myth blurred. Yet among certain priestly circles, stories persisted of a hidden brotherhood that had preserved the teachings of the sun. They spoke of secret gatherings held at dawn in the desert, where initiates faced the horizon in silence, welcoming the first light of day as a living presence. No idols were used, no names spoken, only stillness and the breath of the morning wind. These followers believed that truth could never be destroyed, only obscured. They carried fragments of Akhenaten's hymns in their minds, passing them quietly from teacher to student. For them, Aten was not a god of Egypt, but a principle of being, the unseen unity behind all forms, the pulse that connected everything born of the sun's warmth. Though centuries passed, their devotion remained undimmed, existing beyond the boundaries of religion or empire. In distant lands, traders and travelers told of wise men from Egypt who spoke of one light that sustained all worlds. The idea drifted across cultures like pollen carried on wind, finding resonance in other hearts and other tongues. Philosophers of later ages would speak of a single source, unseen yet omnipresent, and though they did not name it Aten, the essence was the same. Akhenaten's revelation had become part of the invisible current of human thought, flowing beneath history's surface. Within Egypt itself, those who remembered his name spoke of him not as heretic or king, but as seeker. His failure was seen as necessary, his fall as sacrifice, for without destruction, no truth could endure. The hidden order that preserved his teachings held no temples, No hierarchy, only shared silence. They met where light touched stone, where dawn broke over the desert cliffs, where words were unnecessary. They saw in the sunrise not merely warmth or beauty, but the eternal reminder that unity could never be erased. Centuries turned to millennia. Dynasties crumbled, empires vanished, yet each morning the same light rose over the Nile, touching the same sand, casting the same shadows. Farmers still paused at dawn to greet the day, unaware that their gesture echoed the forgotten worship of Aten. The sacred had never truly left. It had only changed its form, slipping beneath language, living quietly within the rhythm of life itself. In hidden libraries, fragments of his hymns were rediscovered, their poetry still shimmering with power. They spoke of a God without image, of creation born from love, of a light that gave breath to all beings. To scholars, these words seemed prophetic, ahead of their time. To those who still felt the pull of mystery, they were more than poetry. They were truth rediscovered, a whisper from the ancient horizon. Those who walked through the ruins of Akhenaten centuries later felt an unspoken reverence. The desert had claimed the city, yet its essence lingered in the air, in the pale shimmer of dawn rising over the cliffs. Sand had buried the stones, but not the dream. Somewhere beneath their feet, the hidden order still seemed to breathe, silent yet alive, waiting for another age to listen. And as the sun climbed above the horizon, gilding the dunes in molten light, it was as if Akhenaten's voice spoke once more, not from tombs or temples, but from the living world itself. His light had never died. It had only hidden, enduring, in the quiet brilliance of every sunrise, in every heart that still sought truth in the warmth of the sun. Centuries dissolved into dust, yet the story of the Pharaoh who whispered to the sun refused to fade. His name, erased from stone and cursed by priests, continued to echo through time like a hidden melody. Travelers, poets, and mystics of later ages spoke of a king who had seen beyond the gods, who dared to look into the heart of creation and call it one. Though the world had tried to forget him, memory has its own will, and truth, once touched by light, cannot be buried forever. Archaeologists digging through the sands of Amarna, the name now given to the fallen city of Akhenaten, uncovered fragments of his lost vision. Shards of pottery, inscriptions half buried in dunes, and walls faintly marked with sun disks revealed a civilization that had once burned with faith unlike any other. Among those ruins, scholars found traces of hymns so poetic, so luminous, that they felt almost modern. A voice speaking across 3,000 years, reminding humanity that divinity lives not above, but within. Modern eyes gazing upon his statues often see not madness, but brilliance. The elongated face, the serene smile, the androgynous form, they no longer seem deformities of arrogance, but symbols of transcendence, of a soul that sought to embody something greater than man or God. Akhenaten's art, once condemned, now stands as the first in history to portray love, family, and spiritual intimacy with such tenderness. What his people once feared, the world now studies with wonder. Nefertiti's image, too, rose from silence. Her face, uncovered from beneath layers of sand, became one of the most famous symbols of ancient beauty ever known. Together their legacy, once obliterated, now draws millions to museums and documentaries, to whispered retellings beneath the glow of modern screens. The heretic king and his radiant queen, long condemned, are now remembered not as destroyers of gods, but as seekers of truth. Historians debate whether Akhenaten was philosopher or fanatic, visionary or tyrant. Yet beyond argument lies something undeniable, that he was the first to speak of one divine essence, connecting all life, the first to dream of a faith without fear, a light without name. His voice, carried through millennia, has influenced prophets, poets, and thinkers who never knew his name. The ripples of his vision stretch far beyond his empire's fall. As night descends upon the ruins of his city, the stars shimmer where once his temples stood. The same sun that rose over his horizon still climbs each morning, bathing the world in gold. Time has changed everything, and yet nothing. The light remains, unbroken. His dream survives not in monuments or doctrines, but in every soul that looks to the dawn and feels wonder, in every heart that believes unity lies beyond division. His legacy is not one of conquest or power, but of awakening. He reminded humanity that truth cannot be owned, that gods need no image, that light itself is eternal. The city of the horizon may have fallen, but the horizon itself never disappears. Each sunrise is his resurrection, each breath beneath its glow a continuation of the story he began. And so, as the ancient hymn whispers once more through the sands of Egypt, the voice of the Lightbringer still calls to those who listen. Thou art in my heart, there is none other who knows thee, save thy Son whom thou hast made. The words echo across time, from temple to tomb, from history into the present moment, as the same sun that once crowned the Pharaoh now warms the faces of all who inherit his light. If this story of Akhenaten, the Pharaoh who defied the gods and followed the sun, stirred your imagination and spirit, take a moment to let his light continue to spread. Subscribe to the channel for more journeys through the hidden corners of ancient history. Like this video to keep the story glowing. Share it with those you love so they too may feel the warmth of forgotten worlds, and leave a comment below. Your thoughts, reflections, or simply a whisper to the sun. Every word keeps the flame alive.